Mr. Loder.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's always a pleasure to follow the right honourable gentleman for North Durham. I'm sorry that all the House except me were on their telephone, so I hope to be a little bit more entertaining and should we say, from a different perspective than he. I would just like to say to him, though, if I've got it correct, Durham Council has £29 million last year for a revenue support grant, compared to Dorset having zero. So I think it might be just worthwhile him going back to his local council and others to maybe just ask a few questions about that, maybe rather than the government. However, Mr. Deputy Speaker, this evening I'm here to. I've risen to make the case for rural England, particularly, and also West Dorset, because I'm very conscious that 12 months ago, a number of us were here in this place to comment on and to debate, indeed, the motion that indeed is before us today. I should just like to say I'm delighted to support the comments from the Honourable Member for Waveney earlier, particularly in respect of rural areas, because, Mr. Deputy Speaker, it is very clear for me that we do have a disparity that we are faced with, that we are in this motion and the report before us. And it's not necessarily the disparity that some share, but it is very clearly, in my mind, one between rural and urban, and I think it's important that we fully digest it. Rural areas will receive, per head, £111 less, according to the settlement funding assessment, than urban counterparts. Yet rural residents often pay, on average, £110 more in council tax than urban areas. And when we see that we get 13% less per head in social care support overall, it does mean, on those few points alone, that we have real issues to contend with, especially in constituencies such as mine. I think it's worth noting that London, as an authority area, gets £236 million more in government grant than the formula says it should. So I appreciate that the comments I had last year and indeed more recently about the funding formula, it's very difficult to change it. But it feels to me as it might not be so difficult to change it in one direction as it is in another. And I think in the interests of parity and fairness, it is important that we understand why is it easier to adjust it in the upward direction in some cases and not in others. I think it's an important point to note. But of course, very relevant to me in rural areas is the Rural Services Delivery Grant. I think the Honourable Member for Waveney made mention of this earlier, and I should just like to echo his comments, because rural councils last year, that's the 22-23 year, were only able to budget a spend of £67 per head on so-called discretionary services. Now that, I think, is totally unacceptable, especially when you compare to urban areas that are £131 per head. And of course, that's primarily because in constituencies such as mine, 2/3 of the council's income goes to support those in adult and child social care, which is a huge amount, partly also because, of course, our average age in Dorset is so high. Those services that we have in Dorset are more expensive to deliver. That's partly because of sparse geography. It's also because of a number of other issues as well. But I think the thing that's really relevant here is that if England's rural communities were treated as one distinct region in the same way that we see maybe mayoral authorities and others, that the need for levelling up would be singularly greater than any other area in the country. And I think that's an important point to note. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I have mentioned, and I'd just like to reiterate, the key effect that local authorities actually are not just here to empty bins. there is an increasingly difficult issue and a rising issue in respect of adult social care. We have heard mention about transport as well, which I understand we're faced with great difficulties coming up. I understand there is no solution to bus funding locally from the 1st of April onwards, if I have that correct. And for rural communities that are very dependent on being able to get to the doctor to do their shopping, especially for older people that don't drive, the way we find solutions to that is where the local council will step in. Now, when we are in a situation of a very, very small revenue support grant, I mean, I have to say, in fairness to my honourable friend and right honourable friend on the front bench, I am somewhat delighted that we've taken a step forward in revenue support grants. I remember this time last year we were at 0, and we've taken an enormous stride forward of, I think, 654,000, which is an important and welcome step. But I should just say that I understand some of that's been cancelled out in other ways. That means our net effect is even a little bit smaller than that. The primary issue, though, that I have in Dorset is that actually from a council tax perspective, this is where we are picking it up. So we've gone for many years with a 0 revenue support grant. It has meant the council has had to fund some very important and crucial services as the council tax. That's why council tax at an average Band D level is the 3rd highest in the country. It's £800 more than a number of you in this chamber for Band D that constituents of yours in this chamber will have to pay. That is a huge amount, and particularly when we take care of people who may have moved into Dorset, who've retired to Dorset, and there's an associated social care requirement. That does mean, I think, and does point to even more strongly the need for the local government funding mechanisms to be reformed and adjusted. There is a perception, and I've listened both in this debate and previous debates, that the southeast and particularly southwest of England is particularly well off compared to the north and the northeast. I would just like to say that that is absolutely not the case. My honourable friend and neighbour, the member for South Dorset, who's not able to be here in this debate this afternoon, we have a shared area in Weymouth in Portland that is the worst area for social mobility in the whole country, according to the Social Mobility Commission. And then you look at the situation we're faced with council tax and the comments that were made earlier in the debate about how people who are in poverty, particularly urban poverty, struggle in this area. We have to ask ourselves, why is it that rural hardship doesn't matter in the same way if that is indeed the case? And we, on the south coast, particularly in Dorset, have a good number of very difficult issues to contend with that makes it quite hard for us to be able to justify sometimes the situation of which we face when it comes to the council tax and revenue support grant. Mr Deputy Speaker, I'd like to conclude my remarks by kindly asking my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, to consider a few things, and I should be delighted to hear from him in the wind-ups at the end as to whether or not he might be able to make some progress. I'm hoping that we will be able to expedite, or he will be able to expedite, the reviews of which we've talked about for some time, whether that's the formula for revenue support grant funding or others. I'm particularly keen to be able to meet with him along with the leaders of the rural councils in England to discuss how we can make real progress and sorting out this enormous disparity and unfairness about how the formula, in my opinion, goes to support urban areas much more so than it does rural areas, and I don't think we should have that challenge. So I would be very pleased to hear from my right honourable friend if he would agree to such a meeting. And finally, I would be also very grateful to hear from him as to what commitment he might offer to us in Dorset as to how better we can have that support for rural communities to address the issues we face. Thank you.
Deputy Speaker, the Government's latest local government finance statement represents a continuation